Ever since the horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk, it seems like an hour can't go by without someone, be it a talking head, a professor, a politician, or somebody on the left who's offended because they got fired for, well, dancing on Charlie Kirk's grave. Screaming that getting fired for their speech is, well, a violation of the First Amendment free speech right. They're wrong. The First Amendment, including the free speech clause, protects Americans from interference from the government in their fundamental rights, including speech. And when I say it protects America from the government, I mean every government, whether it be federal, state, or local, whether it be the president or your local dog catcher. However, it does not apply to private entities, whether it be a company, a university, a private high school, or your local charity. It just does not apply to private institutions. Therefore, if a private entity fires an employee for speech they don't like, it is by definition not a First Amendment free speech issue. In fact, if you're an at-will employee, which most Americans are, that's just a person that's not covered by a contract or a collective bargaining agreement, you can be fired for any reason except an illegal reason. And the illegal reasons are, well, there's just a few of those. And to my knowledge, there's no law in the books in any state that I know of that prohibits a company from firing a person for speech that they disagree with. Now, government employees or public employees, if you prefer, that's a little bit different because the First Amendment does apply to the government. However, once again, when the government is acting as an employer, the courts have repeatedly held, all the way to the Supreme Court, that they do have quite a bit of latitude in firing people for their speech. Beginning in 1968, the Supreme Court heard 3 cases in which they set forth the criteria that the government would have to meet in order to fire a person for their speech without offending the First Amendment free speech clause. In Pickering v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court held that if the speech of the employee is such that it adversely affects the efficiency of the government's agency to do its job outweighs the value of the speech to the employee and the public, then the employee can be fired. As Professor Volk, one of the foremost experts on the Constitution and constitutional law in the U.S., points out, that the courts often look to how big of a controversy the speech has created. If there's a huge public outcry, then they've often held, or most often held, that the firing is justified and not in violation of the First Amendment. The rationale for this approach seems to be that the outrage, or the widespread outrage, among the public establishes that the damage to the agency's ability to do its mission outweighs what value the speech may have to the individual or the public. Taking that to the Charlie Kirk assassination, there is very little value of celebrating a political assassination of a person you disagree with, and there is a whole lot of outrage amongst the public. So yes, under the current test, firing public employees for celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk does not offend the First Amendment's free speech clause. In summary, firing a person, whether they're a private employee or a public employee, for celebrating Charlie Kirk's death does not offend the First Amendment. Having said that, I think we all need to take a deep breath and think about where we're going with free speech. I have no problem firing people for celebrating the assassination of another person, just like I have no problem with people being fired for racist or anti-Semitic or homophobic comments. But these standards have to be applied across the board regardless of political affiliation or ideological beliefs. Having said that, I think we're at the far limits of where we can allow the government to engage in policing speech for public employees. I, for one, will support no further government authority to fire people for their speech. With that, you have a great day. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you later.